AnNua means the new in Irish. I grew up here and then we emigrated, like so many others because of the Troubles. And we went to Australia and there I trained and then I worked largely in Asia and Australia. So I had a lot of world influences really. Came back about 8 years ago and I liked being here. I was teaching a bit and then I decided to stay and start making some theatre here. What I did notice was that a lot of the theatre that was being made was almost quite cottagey still. So there were still some ideas of theatre that very much remained in the sort of naturalistic tradition of theatre. And of course, because I'd been in Australia and Asia, etc., I was been affected particularly aesthetically by quite abstract influences. So we decided to create a theatre really that linked Irish theatre to and Irish traditions to world theatre. We didn't have the money to have an ensemble or to have a theatre company as such, so we formed a sort of loose collective of associated artists. In the last 3 years, actually, we've been together since 2009, so we've been together for about 6. In the last 3, I had to do a bit of an audit. We've worked with well over 100 artists, and I mean well over. What we tend to do is each project will put together a team, and there are some people that are sort of in there more often. We'll put together a team. Usually that's a composer. We use a great deal of music because music here is thick on the ground. There are many, many really good musicians, and in every sort of genre of music. Depending on the sort of show it is, you work with Chris Norby a lot, who's a young composer who now works in America. I'm working with him at the moment on a show called Civilians, which is about really the place of civilians in warfare today. We're just at the beginning of that lovely stage when we're actually inventing and just throwing ideas around. So we would go out and gather from the environment. That could be from the physical environment, so we would look at soundscapes, etc., which we did a lot in home. We got some money from the British Council to go to Australia, so we were recording bush sounds there, but also down by the sea, which is where it's set.
Oh, yeah.
So we would go out and we would record some from the environment. We would record some from the cultural environment. So we would collect samples of music if people offered them up. Again, in home, people could offer up different musical traditions from places they came from, and quite often people who you would be interviewing, who you would go, well, have you got any music either to play to us or something we can source? And quite often people would go, oh, I actually play such and such, which is lovely. So they have their input from their ideas. Yep. We also gather their languages and voices, etc. And then we incorporate that into design quite often. So the composer will take some of that on board. Quite often we'll work with a sound engineer as well, who might add in, for instance, in home, we had the voices of refugees, which were on the wind coming off the sea. Socially, we will collect from the environment as well. That's more the interview, more sort of standard ethnography. I think I mentioned before, we call this a creative ethnography, partly because it sums it up very quickly, but also it explains where it's come from and its influences. I was trained in acting, and then I went on to do a PhD looking at the acting profession, and that was a sociology of the acting profession. And I did a lot of ethnography, obviously, and sort of an anthropological approach to some degrees. That affected everything that I did in terms of creation. And I would hope it sort of democratized the process, so I wouldn't tend to create alone. I would tend to create in a team and go out and gather all this material. The other thing is that quite often now the people we're working with, the other artists, also are trained at postgrad level, and so that's sort of caught on, and we all enjoy doing that. That's been really good. We scrape and we get by. I was just thinking about that this morning. We tended to be on small amounts from various organisations. We quite often will partner up now with organisations. That helps a lot, particularly in this environment, because then they go, oh, we can fund 2 for 1. But it means that you're having influences from all over the place, which is nice. Quite often we've approached universities, and because of our approach and etc., that quite often has worked. we've been funded through the British Council, we've been funded through Arts NI, we've been funded down south a little bit and on the local level. As I say, they're all small amounts. Now we're up to a stage where I think we probably could start knocking on the door for larger amounts of funding. However, what we probably will do is keep it project to project, because I like the freedom of that. It means that all of us can go away and do other things. It means we're not trying to maintain a sort of bulky administration, publicity, etc. We can get someone in to handle that on a project basis, perhaps a month before we begin, so all the press, etc. is set up. But it's still a great deal cheaper. It appeals to funders. But as I say, it's the sort of setup that I would enjoy more anyway, because it means, for instance, it means I can go off and do other things such as teaching or travel.
I think there's a bit of a problem in that in Australia certainly, and here I think as well, and probably in England, arts bodies try to do a couple of things, and quite often what they're asking you to do is have a social impact and produce innovative work of artistic excellence. Sometimes that's a very hard call to be doing both. Our way of negotiating that, as I said, is to develop a way that we can go out and gather and then incorporate what we've gathered into the design, etc., mixing a professional cast with a less professional cast, etc. So you are getting direct community input. As regards the other lines like composition and music, there's no way any of us could do it as well as the people who are doing it here, so we will just directly bring it in, do you know what I mean? So we go with the community strengths, and where we think there might not be such strengths, for instance, in terms of design and stuff, we'll try and gather artistic stuff, which is really strong, and then incorporate that in. In that way, I think at times we are producing work that is excellent, but it also has a social impact that's positive. I'm not sure that we should always be trying to do both. Do you know what I mean? I think, unfortunately, there's not much money around, so that's partly the problem. They're not necessarily mutually exclusive, but that at the same time, as I say, you shouldn't always be. And I also think that increasingly we're being told sort of what to make in terms of social impact, and that can be really difficult, particularly if you're trying to write something and you're being told what to write. And then I look back at theatre history and I think, well, what would have happened to all the people like Artaud, Genet, Beckett? Endless. I mean, if they'd gone to apply for a grant today, what would have happened? They wouldn't have got very far at all. What is your social impact? I want to destroy the society. That would have been Artaud, followed by a lot of expletives. But in seriousness, I mean, I think we have a fairly basic idea of what social impact is and also what poverty is. And sometimes it's very easy for governments and government bodies, and I sense that, I know arts bodies are at arm's length, but to a degree, they certainly seem to share the same notions of what social and cultural capital are that governments do, and those are quite, I think, simple notions that can quantify. We give this amount of money, we have this amount of impact, these are the claims that the theatre makes, etc., etc. I mean, when I did academic work, I was more influenced by some of the European thinkers, and particularly Bourdieu, etc., in terms of cultural capital. Now, his field is not nearly as pleasant as the Americans, Robert Putnam, and the people who have influenced Western governments across the board, as far as I can see. So Putnam's very much a liberal. So if you put money, invest it into cultural enterprises, that will necessarily have a positive effect in the communities in which you're working. Whereas Bourdieu looks at culture more as a bit of a fist fight in many ways, and also an exercise in power often as well. Yeah. Yes, a lot of the people we work with are economically poor, but the people we write about also, I was thinking about it, they tend to be poor. It sounds a little odd, socially almost, or existentially. They either lack hope, or they're homeless, or the first play we did was about suicide. So they tend to be people in fairly desperate situations. Depending on which group of people, then we'll go and seek those people out.
Yeah. I mean, there's certainly certain areas where it's a real problem. Poverty grinds down on people, and it means, you know, poverty can make people lose their zest for life completely in lots of different ways. That said, Ireland's a really interesting place to work, and this is one of the reasons I like working here. We use the term often socio-economic, and we seem to assume that the social and the culture are necessarily in sync with the economic, or what's the word, positively correlated to the economic. And here that's not the case. I think what happened in Ireland, yes, it industrialised, etc., but not to the same extent. And it's a little bit like some Asian countries I've worked in, particularly Bali, where the traditional culture has survived into the modern world, and people, regardless, well, there are hierarchies within that, but people still use those cultural connections expressively through various art forms. So in Ireland, the difference between high and low culture, particularly in traditional Irish arts, there isn't that distinction that there is in other cultures. So you would have Irish visual work, music, etc., which could end up in museums or in art galleries, etc., but it will also be practiced by people on the ground. Very, very rich culturally on the ground, regardless of economics, to a point. There are some areas that I've worked in, and there are some places where obviously the deprivation is there to the extent where people have a lot of associated problems that would prevent the sort of cultural expression that I'm talking about. But as I said before, one of the main reasons I've stayed here is that there is so much to use. The other thing I've learned from working here or anywhere else is, rather than coming into an environment and going, right, we're going to do this, it's really worthwhile coming in and just watching for a while and seeing what's on offer and then incorporating that in. Obviously, it makes ethnographic sense in academia, and it also makes sense creatively. We're not a community company in the sense that we will go in and involve a community directly on stage, for instance. That said, we do to some degree. So there's no training here for actors or directors, etc., which makes it a very strange environment in lots of ways. And quite often we will get someone who comes in and then works for us over a series of productions. And in terms of acting, I've learned, all right, we can actually teach someone in that situation gradually to acquire the skills that they would need to go on sort of in professional life. So in that way, we can immerse people in a community. The other way, of course, we do is through this ethnography by collecting all the direct material and then us processing it, etc. I think I mentioned as well that we'll mix up professionals with people who are less experienced, and that's had a really interesting, has some really interesting output, because it means that you can reach those levels of excellence, or whatever you want to call it, or aesthetic complexity, but you can also involve people directly.
And we learn a lot with the people that we engage with. And I think everybody crossed, when we went around and collected wee comments and things, some of which are on the site, I was really pleased because people said, oh, well, I've never worked with a puppeteer before, or I've never worked with a musician before, or I've never worked with someone who's doing computer-generated things. So there's a lot of cross-fertilisation going on. There's quite a lot of, it's quite a young city, so there's a lot of kids coming through training institutions, etc. And they're great because they're really versatile, they're really committed, they know what they're doing. I haven't got a bloody clue what half of them are doing. And so they know a whole lot of stuff that we can gain from as well, and they can gain from what we're doing. So yeah, the training goes both ways.
The other thing was, because we're gathering from all over the place, we have to do basically what academics do. So we quite often would have release forms to make sure that people are all right with the way we're using things. We quite often will say as well, look, what we'll do is we'll take this material away, then we'll get in touch with you, we'll show you how we're using it, and we can even aesthetically show you how we're using it, and if you're not happy with that, then we won't use it, which is a fair enough deal. If someone is contributing, say, music, etc., and it's not just a wee snippet, we'll try, if we can, to give them a wee payment, which is just sort of really lovely for them, and for, I know what it's like to be an artist in the world alone. That little bit of legitimization, it's not so much the money. You might get, you know, a couple of £100 if you're putting in maybe part of a wee song or something. But to get that legitimization, which goes, there you are, you're professional, you're part of this, is a huge thing, not just for struggling artists, but for people generally. Then if the show went on and looked like it might start to get some sort of income or exposure, we would actually go back and go, right, well, we need to cut you in on this to, you know, some percentage, etc., which is it hasn't happened often yet because we're just beginning to tour. So we just did a show in England, and that might tour more. That would be the sort of show where you'd be going back to people and going, you know, what do you think's fair, etc.
So I emigrated from Ireland when I was 10. So I had a fair idea of what that process involves. We then went out and interviewed migrants and talked to other people about their migrant experience. And it could have been people who had lost family or people who had migrated into Ireland. There's different people coming now. We've got some Syrian refugees arriving soon, which is great. But also caused a bit of a stir as well, as usual. So we gathered together these stories, but what became clear very quickly is that what I'd experienced as a child is what most migrants experience, and I think there are certain patterns there, and how people deal with those things varies quite a bit, a good deal, even within my own family. So we all went. Some of our extended family went. We were obviously moving away from the Troubles, so we were all a bit headspace anyway, but certain members of my family just didn't react well to that idea of moving and losing contact and became homeless, basically. Others adapted very quickly and really, gained a lot from the experience. So we gathered all that material, as I say. We put a very basic backstory of a child who's migrated and then become quite a lost soul in adult life. We mixed that up with sort of ideas in Australia of the swaggy. The swaggy is someone that goes on walkabout basically from place to place, and they don't ever settle down. And that, in a sense, that character has existed in Australia from the early colonial days when people would be walking from mine to mine or farm to farm. And it was about 2 years in the making. And then we premiered that in Liverpool in June this year. And it went really well, which is great. So we got some good reviews, which is really important for later work and making a bit of money. We hope to tour it. Well, it's just the grants juggling as always. So we've got a couple of grants in to tour in Ireland, in Australia and in England. Which ones will light up? I don't know. So Civilians is the one we're doing right now, about war in the 20th, 21st century, particularly about the place of civilians in the war, because I suspect that, well, as we know from the ways of migration, etc., the lines are getting more and more blurred between who's a combatant and who's a civilian. We threw it out there about a year ago, and then people started just putting things back, and that works in lots of different ways. But again, it's sort of like fishing online. So a lot of stuff will just come in. So we got some people have sent in some artwork, some writing, etc., and we gather all that together. Now I'm hoping to work with Echo, one of the other groups here, on this, so that we can do a sort of group devised creative process as well. And what we'll do is we'll all research, and by that, again, I'm affected by the social sort of sociology I've done. So I would say to people, okay, well, how have you been affected by war? So, and because it's the North, that could go on forever, because everyone's been affected by war here. And then I go, okay, we'll go out and we'll chat to some people, just, over the weekend, chat to 4 different people about their experiences of what. And so they bring all that stuff back in. And quite often we'll use just Zoom recorders to do that, just in case something comes up that we can then use later in performance. And then we do the big picture research, which is like reading on war in the 21st century or watching documentaries, just watch The Fog of War, etc. I like researching that way because it allows, you get your personal, you get your ethnographic, and you get your structural. It sounds academic, but having done that academic work, I suddenly went, well, why wouldn't you make creative work this way? Like, otherwise, it's going to be the genius standing back going, well, I have a world view and here it is. Whereas I think most good writers anyway will work in a similar way. They will go out and gather and then, start stewing around.